That was a very, very moving introduction. I'm so grateful. I really, at the end of that spiel, I was not expecting it to be about me, so that was a little... Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here again. Really, really happy to be here. So thank you so much for having me this morning, especially to the Social Action Committee who selected me for the Social Justice Scholar in Residence role. And I'll introduce myself a little further in a moment. But I'd like to start actually with a story. So Mariam, a mother of 3 school-age children, moved to Canada to join her brother after her husband died in her home country. She works as a house cleaner when she can, but her schedule is limited by her children's daycare hours, and often she can only earn enough to cover their care and her rent with little left over. There's days when there's not enough to feed her children, or enough to feed her children but not herself, and she feels alone in her hunger and her grief. She's been in Canada for over a year when she finds out about her local food bank. She's welcomed with open arms by a volunteer who speaks her language and provided with an abundant hamper of foods, both fresh and non-perishable, that she can use to feed her boys something healthy for once. Food provided by a local church's food drive. She's connected with an after-school program that can watch her children while she picks up more hours, and a grief counselor who can support her and her children through the loss of their father. She cries with joy and relief on the way home on the phone to her brother, and her children are over the moon at new snacks in their lunchboxes. Mariam is not a real person, but there are many real people who share her struggles. Unfortunately, there are fewer than you might expect who share her happy ending. In many ways, fewer and fewer all the time. But let me introduce myself. So, as the rabbi said, my name is Izzy Waxman. I'm the executive director of MAZON Canada, the Jewish Response to Hunger. On behalf of the Jewish community, MAZON supports hundreds of food aid programs across the country, from Iqaluit to Newfoundland to coastal BC, really all across the country, with the resources that they need to better care for both Jewish and non-Jewish people in need, people like Mariam and her children. And as someone who has devoted many years of my life to food aid and to fighting hunger, I'm here to pop some bubbles of fantasy that we like to hold about Canada's food aid system in 2022. Let's talk first about the history of food banks. There were no food banks in the 1950s. A food bank is not just a place where you go to pick up food. In sector terms, that's actually a food pantry. A food bank is a larger institution that collects all of the possible rescued or donated food in a region to distribute to food pantries, drop-ins, community centers, et cetera, across a whole region, a county or a municipality, or even a province. As long as there have been kind people and poor people, there have been soup kitchens and there have been food pantries. But the thing that is new is the food bank, these massive centralizing bodies that only emerged in the 1980s. So how did this happen? What was going on that made this rise in food banks necessary? Starting after the Second World War, strong systems of social welfare were built across Canada. From the 40s through the 70s, provinces and the federal government increasingly shared the costs of ensuring that citizens were given the bare minimum opportunities to make a decent life for themselves, although discriminatory exceptions were often made on the basis of race, gender, etc. But in the 1980s, when a wave of privatization and neoliberalism hit that was not unique to Canada, many of these programs were limited or cut completely. In 1984, Brian Mulroney pledged in his campaign for the Prime Ministry that universal family allowances and pensions for all were, quote, a sacred trust not to be tampered with. And yet, once in power, severe budget cuts affected supports for families and children and seniors, affordable housing, employment training, EI, and more. Nearly every program supporting low-income people was clawed back. By 1993, the federal spending was down 25%, but there had been no serious assault on the budget deficit, even though Ottawa was by then taking in more in taxes than it was spending on programs. The federal family allowance was eliminated. The old age security plan was limited for the middle class. EI was made harder to access and available for shorter time periods. Darchei Noam is an incredible congregation that contains within its membership, and I'm sure in the audience today in person and on Zoom, Many valiant activists and organizers who I'm sure remember not only the headlines as these clawbacks were rolled out, but the desperation that they felt as dystopic visions of poor people abandoned by the state stretched on into the future. They knew then the problems that this would create, and they set about to change them. While political advocacy was necessary to reverse these, frankly, sadistic and ineffective austerity measures, there were also mouths to feed today. So food pantries and hot meal programs began collaborating, pooling resources to access bigger spaces and bulk pricing. Food aid grew from storefronts to warehouses. Thousands and thousands of good people rolled up their sleeves and built the infrastructure that the state wouldn't, telling themselves, just until the next election, just until the next budget announcement, just a little more. When Food Banks Canada was incorporated in 1989, they included a 3-year sunset clause, an assumption that the need for this pseudo-governmental infrastructure would be over by 1991. But despite their efforts, clearly, a future without the necessity of food banks has not arisen. The unfortunate truth is that as I stand here before you today, Canada is in the midst of the most desperate crisis of hunger of recent history. Believe it or not, worse than at the peak of pandemic closures. Between food banks, hot meal drop-ins, community dinners at places of worship, school and after-school nutrition programs, and more, a network of more than 60,000 food aid programs works to feed Canadians. That's 4 for every 1 grocery store. And unfortunately for Mariam, 40 years after these austerity measures took hold, things don't always go as smoothly as my earlier story. Despite the best efforts of strong volunteers, nonprofit staff, and communities, food banks are not and never will be a solution to food insecurity. Before I detail the problems, I also want to remind you that as things stand, food aid programs are critical and they are life-changing. There are many Mariams out there crying with joy on their way home with a box of food, and I work hard every day to give that feeling to just one more person and one more and one more. But still, 5.8 million Canadians were food insecure last year, an increase from 4.5 million before the pandemic. That number doesn't even include some of the people most likely to be food insecure, like homeless people, Indigenous people living on reserve, and people in the far north. That number includes 3 levels of food insecurity that we talk about in the sector: mild, moderate, and severe. Mild food insecurity means that at least once a month, they've worried about running out of food or had a limited food selection due to financial constraints. Severe food insecurity means that they miss meals, reduce food intake, or even go days without food. The first major problem with food banks is this. While those 60,000 programs serve all of the 5.8 million, food banks and food pantries realistically only help people at the furthest extreme. People just don't call for help until the pantry is truly bare. When Food Banks Canada measures food pantry visits annually in March, there were 1.5 million visits this year. That's up 36% from before the pandemic, when there was a mere 1.1 million. Does that mean that there are 1.5 million severely food insecure people in Canada? Unfortunately not. This measurement only tells us how many people actually visited a food pantry, not how many people called in a moment of crisis and were turned away. If Mariam called today, many places she'd likely be put on a wait list or sent on an endless and humiliating loop of referrals to programs that all say they can't help. Another sobering thing to know about food banks is that while an increasing number work hard to provide high-quality food to their communities, the sector is desperately underfunded compared to the level of need. So most hampers will provide at most a few days of food, designed to band-aid the problem for half a week at the end of the month, when rent is due. But for a growing number of people, the problem isn't a once-a-month issue. It's a chronic problem, and a monthly or biweekly hamper isn't enough. Even after support, they're still food insecure. Plus, many food banks almost entirely relied on donated or rescued food, which can be inconsistent. Many people donate cans at the back of the pantry that even they don't want to eat. Mariam might not be crying with relief if she's sent home with miscellaneous items like a bottle of barbecue sauce and 2 single-serving microwavable portions of rice and dry pasta with no sauce and dehydrated mushrooms. There's just no meal that she can cook with those ingredients. There's no use for salad dressing if you can't afford the lettuce. There's no point to ingredients that her children, who are still unused to Western food, won't eat. And while most food aid programs supplement donated or rescued food with purchased food to try to ensure decent quality hampers for people in need, they're caught in the same inflationary bind as their clients right now. Food simply costs more than it did even a year ago. They have more mouths to feed, and their dollars go less far. In short, our food bank system, a piecemeal and patchwork quilt of disconnected programs, all struggling to collaborate while also helping their communities, help a small percentage of the most vulnerable people just a little bit. But the system that created this poverty and instability remains untouched. I also want to underline again that food banks are not, they're not only critical right now, but that their imperfections should not be a scandal. They're doing amazing work, given that they're trying to spin gold out of wool, and they're getting better and better at addressing these problems all the time. I just want to underline again that food banks are not the problem. Paul Taylor, outgoing ED of FoodShare, says this about the actual problem. Despite the fact that Canada is a signatory to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, in which the right of all people to food and to feed themselves in dignity is entrenched, we have for years relied on the charitable sector, food banks in particular, to fulfill the state's obligation to meet that need. With food prices inflating over summer, that 1.5 million visits in March has likely ballooned already by fall, and still likely underrepresents the number of people who are suddenly severely food insecure. Their pantries are bare, their plates are empty, and at this moment in Canadian history, when they call 911, no ambulance is coming. The food banks are full with thousands of people like them. And I have one further terrible piece of news for you. Even in wealthy Canada, hunger kills. While it's rare to see someone here starve to death, visible bones and sunken in, hunger kills in 1,000 other ways that disguise themselves as other things. Recent Canadian 2020 data, shows that severe food insecurity is associated with higher mortality across all causes of death except cancers. Death rates were 50% increased for severely food insecure people. You're more likely to die in surgical recovery if you are food insecure. You're at higher risk of cardiovascular disease. You're less likely to survive an infectious disease or an accidental injury. If you're severely food insecure, your life expectancy is almost a decade shorter than a food secure person's. These health issues and early deaths mean less wealth is accumulated in a generation, leaving less to pass on and contributing to generational poverty. So what am I to do? As executive director of a food aid community foundation, fundraise like a demon, for one thing, fundraise like lives depend on it, because they do, scream about this food aid crisis from the rooftops, begging others to do the same, amplify the voices of people choosing between food and rent, food and medication. And I'm proud to tell you that MAZON's slogan is true. When Canadians go hungry, the Jewish community cares. This year, in response to this unprecedented crisis, MAZON ran the most successful Rosh Hashanah campaign in our history and are allocating an equally unprecedented sum of $1 million this year, almost triple what we were allocating 5 years ago, and supporting over 200 food programs across Canada. You should really see the map of all of them spread across the country. It's on our website. These programs represent the labor of thousands and thousands of people, good people, hardworking people, who sweat blood to do right by their communities. This year we received more requests for support than ever, and we're happy to be announcing our complete list of recipients later this month. This list includes school meals for children, building brighter futures, programs that check in on isolated seniors. It includes small-town food pantries that refuse to say no to anyone, even if that means the volunteers there are in personal debt buying one more bag of groceries and one more and one more. And it includes programs that take Indigenous youth out on the land with elders, teaching them to hunt and forage and fish, to provide for their families and their communities, and healing the wounds of colonialism as they connect to tradition. For the first time this year, we're also tracking which programs are run by and for the communities that they serve, valuing leadership that often faces philanthropic discrimination, like Black, Indigenous, or newcomer leadership. And we estimate that our support this year will provide 250,000 meals, or an average of 600 meals a day across the country, to people of all ages, ethnicities, faiths, and abilities, a tangible way that we collectively express our Jewish values. The grants we give them will help some programs feed more people. At others, it will help them provide some fresh produce or proteins alongside their basic staples. And at others, it means guaranteed staples are available alongside miscellaneous donations to turn that barbecue sauce into a full meal. Each and every one is different. But there's more work to do. MAZON was founded in 1986 in that first wave of clawbacks on 3 strategic pillars: advocacy for policy reforms that would prevent hunger and poverty rather than respond to it, to educate the Jewish community on the realities of poverty and what they can do about it, including policy solutions, and lastly, to support that emergent network of food programs as a temporary last resort. I've spoken to our early leadership, the founding board members, the first EDs, and while they're proud that MAZON is still committed to fighting this fight, they're gutted that anyone 36 years after the program they founded began still needs to have my job. And those austerity measures are still in place. Minimum wages are wildly out of touch with the cost of living. Senior disability and family supports are starvation level compared to food costs. Did you know that in Ontario, the maximum disability support you can receive is $1,200 a month, while Toronto's average rent for a studio apartment is $1,700 a month? So the second critical thing that I have to do beyond fundraising for emergency food aid should be obvious by now, and I hope that you will all join me. We have to advocate for the return of the social safety net. We have to demand of our politicians that the safety of low-income people be their highest priority, above the interests of large corporations or wealthy individuals. We have to support people who organize for better wages. We have to demand that when social reforms return, they're inclusive of all who are in need without the racist barriers of the past. This position is not radical, and it is not new. Almost every national hunger organization has a policy platform or a list of demands. The solutions are well-researched and easily available. Food Banks Canada advocates for a minimum income floor beneath which no Canadian can fall, affordable housing interventions, and the return of expanded EI qualifications. Proof, Canada's leading food policy, hunger policy think tank, recommends increases in welfare benefits and in minimum wages. Community Food Centres Canada demands the collection of race-based data on food insecurity to respond to the alarming inequalities that we know to exist, especially in Black and Indigenous communities. The Coalition for Healthy School Food has fought for years for Canada to start a guaranteed national school nutrition program, following the lead of every single other G7 country. These things are not fantastical. Many would simply be a return to our policy of the 1970s. And while much has changed since then, the need for human dignity has not. That's why MAZON is currently recruiting experienced advocates to launch an advocacy committee, which will be chaired by Darchei Noam's own Laurel Rothman, thank you. And once we're underway in 2023, recruiting people at any level of experience to volunteer with us. And that's why when I go to work today, every day, it's with this vision in mind. A Canada where those who work are paid fairly, enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on their families' plates compared to their local cost of living, that those who are out of work are resourced enough to stay afloat through an employment gap and cared for as they learn a new skill or trade if necessary. And those who cannot work are provided with the necessities, not only to stay sheltered and fed, but to be cared for in comfort and safety. I hold a vision of a world where someone's race, gender, disabilities, or immigration status should not make them more likely to go hungry than anyone else. The problems are severe, but the solutions are obvious. As much as I'm feverishly proud of MAZON Canada's work to feed the hungry over 36 years and still today, I know that we're increasingly a drop in the bucket compared to this crashing tsunami of wealth inequality. But our Jewish tradition teaches us that we each have a role to play in perfecting this broken world, that with each act of compassion, we make the world more compassionate. With each act of strength, we make our communities stronger. In the mystical Jewish tradition, we know that our acts change the world, whether we see the effects or not in our lives. These acts change the heavenly realms, which in turn change our own. So I know and I believe that the work those activists who built those strong social welfare programs from the 40s to the 70s, that those who fought austerity programs from the 80s till today, and those who have since passed or have retired from the fight or who are still fighting alongside with me today, even on this eve of a hunger crisis, their work is not lost. I carry it with me, a North Star guiding us towards a better world. Their work has saved countless lives and continues to. And I know their efforts will not be in vain because this more perfect world is coming. I am building it every day. So while questions may arise about how we get from this dark world to a brighter one, I ask this of you. Do not give up hope. Make demands of your leadership and think about how low-income people when you vote. Get angry and stay angry, but dream of utopian futures. Dream of fresh-baked bread and overflowing bowls. Dream of community gardens in full bloom. Dream of people resourced and empowered to build their own futures, fulfilling work and fulfilling rest. Dream with me of a future beyond food banks, a future where hunger is cured at its source, poverty. And somewhere out there, a future Mariam will be grateful that you did. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me today, you guys. Thanks for holding all my big feelings.